Hey class, we're going to be talking about argumentation today. So if you read chapter 5 or you are thinking about reading chapter 5, maybe you're listening to this first and that's fine. We're sort of digging deeper into critical thinking. What tools do philosophers use to evaluate ideas? I've given you some general criteria. We talked about those 5 C words, clarity and coherence and all that. We're going to get a little bit more specific now. We're going to start talking about different types of arguments. What criteria do we use to evaluate different kinds of arguments? And again, these are just rules of the trade. They do not necessarily lead us to absolute certainty, but they do help us separate the wheat from the chaff, the good arguments from the bad ones. And at least then we know we're heading in the right direction in some sense. So we're going to start by making the distinction between inductive arguments and deductive arguments. This is like the big distinction. And then within inductive arguments, we have several types of inductive arguments, and we have also several types of deductive arguments. Similarly, there are inductive fallacies of inductive reasoning, and there are fallacies of deductive reasoning. Another way of saying these two terms, inductive, we often use the term informal, informal logic, informal fallacies. With deductive arguments, you'll often hear them referred to as formal arguments, formal logic, or formal fallacies. The reason is that with inductive arguments, we're focused mostly on the content, the empirical nature of the argument. It's often predicated on probability. With deductive arguments, we often care more about the form that they're in, the deductive structure. Well, so let's talk a little bit about it. A few terms. Again, I'm sure that these are familiar to at least some of you, but I figure we should sort of get some of the basics down. So an argument is simply two or more statements, often more, one or more of which, an argument is two or more statements, one of which, the conclusion, is supported by the others, which we call the premises. Arguments are used to justify statements or conclusions. This is the process of justification. Premises, then, are those statements used to help justify the conclusion or support the conclusion. The conclusion is the statement that we're trying to justify. To help you, if you look at the conclusion there, your thesis statement for your CAP papers, it should be a conclusion. What is this thing that you're going to try to justify throughout the whole paper? So your thesis statement is your ultimate conclusion for your CAP paper. What's the main point you're trying to send home and that you're trying to justify? The paper is a long, sort of, unfolding attempt to justify that ultimate conclusion, to make it more likely, to give it support, to make it reasonable, to gain assent from those who might read it. So these are some basic terms. An example, we have like a standard form we put arguments in. You're not going to be required to do this much in the class, but just so you know, we typically list the premises here, right? And then you draw the line, and then you've got a conclusion at the bottom. So in this case, premise 1, the band with the most record sales is the best. Premise 2, the Beatles have sold the most records. The conclusion is, therefore, the Beatles are the best band. Now, we're not going to spend too much time here, but if we look at the premises, do the premises support the conclusion, right? I think the way it's structured, yes. The premises do support the conclusion. They're relevant for the conclusion. Now, are the premises factual? That's a different statement, and now I think we have a lot of debate. And just out of curiosity, where do you think the debate would lie? Those that disagree with this argument, what are they going to point to first, do you think? I can give you my opinion. I think it's going to be the connection between record sales and being a good band. I think many people who know music much better than I do, who are involved in music, have a hard time making a connection between the number of albums sold and then also being a good musician or a good band. So making that connection is a little bit dubious, and I think that's where the argument against would lie. And that's where this person who made this argument, that's where the majority of the argument would have to, right? You have to emphasize this. If I'm going to make this argument that's on the screen, then I'm going to need to tell you why sales is directly related to how good a band is, right? And so if I'm going to write a paper about this, as an example, and this is my argument, I'm going to have to really expand, because I've already identified, right? We've already identified this is the problem premise, number one. Premise two, we can prove one way or the other. Either the Beatles did or did not sell the most albums ever. So we can know this just by looking through archives. The real controversy is going to be premise one. So if I was writing a paper and I was going to make this argument, I would spend a lot of my paper trying to support premise one. This is a good strategy for you. When you're writing your CAP papers, look at your argument, look at your outline, right, for your argument, and then you say, where are the controversial elements? I'm going to need to spend time really elaborating there, making my argument, getting information, getting data, making my case. I think that a person who tries to make this argument at some point would see that they're going to have a hard time making a connection between the greatness of a band and the number of albums sold, and they probably need to change their argument. The conclusion might stay the same. They think the Beatles are the best band. But the way they get there, their argument strategy, their premises are probably going to need to change, and they'll need to take a different angle at it. Sometimes you can agree with a conclusion. I do this all the time. I'll agree with a conclusion that a student makes, but the way they got to the conclusion was not a good argument, right? So it's not just about having the right conclusion, because you can get that accidentally. It's about making a good argument that leads to the conclusion. For instance, the conclusion, today is Kelly's birthday. That might be true. Let's assume it is. But then someone asks me, well, how did you come to the conclusion that it was Kelly's birthday? And I said, well, last night I was playing darts and I threw a dart and it hit the number 17, and today's the 17th, so I just assumed it was her birthday. The conclusion may be true, but the way I came to it is a really bad way of making conclusions, right? But someone else might say, well, yeah, it is Kelly's birthday. And let's say we say, well, how do you know? And he goes, well, I looked at her driver's license, and I saw her birth certificate, and I called her mom to verify. And right, well, those are good reasons for believing that today is Kelly's birthday. Same conclusion, one is a good argument, the other a bad argument. So you want to look at your paper like this. What is your ultimate conclusion? What premises are you using to support that conclusion? Where do the weaknesses lie? How are you going to make that case and strengthen it? Okay, keywords for premises and conclusions. It's not always easy to highlight or identify premises and conclusions. When you see words like therefore, what comes after that is a conclusion, typically. When you see a word like thus, whatever, thus, X, that X is a conclusion. Consequently, necessarily, hence, it follows that, for that reason. When you see those kinds of phrases, you know a conclusion is following that. And that helps because once I identify the conclusion, I can say, well, what supports that conclusion? Premises are different. When you see words like because, that's usually a premise supporting a conclusion. Since, for the reason that, you typically, when you have these kinds of terms, you're looking at a premise, not a conclusion. Key questions to ask for your own arguments when you make them in your CAP papers, but also for arguments that you read of others, right? Is the argument structured properly? And we're going to look at some structures to help. But in general, do the premises really support the conclusion they're making? Are they relevant? What evidence is being provided for the conclusion? Is the evidence credible? Right? Is there enough of it? Are they trying to make a conclusion based on a small amount of evidence, or is there enough here? Does the evidence actually support the conclusion? What assumptions are being made? Every argument has assumptions, so that's not necessarily a bad thing. The question are, what kinds of assumptions? Are they good or bad? Right? So we can make certain assumptions, and most people will agree with us, and so we can just move right on with our argument. Other assumptions are much more controversial. At that point, we probably need to make arguments for our assumptions, right? An example will be, in this class it takes place in this is a Master's in Spiritual Formation at a Christian university, so we can all assume that the Bible is relevant for our arguments, that it has authority, right, and that it's relevant when we're making arguments as Christians. And all the people in this class can make that assumption, and you can move on from there. That's not controversial in this context. But if you were in a secular college and you were trying to make the argument, that's a very controversial claim that the Bible has authority for our lives and whatnot. At that point, you're probably going to have to make an argument why the Bible has authority if you're going to use it in an argument. Because if you don't support that assumption, then your argument loses all of its credibility with your audience. In this context, that's okay. Something more controversial, though, if you're assuming the Bible is inerrant, infallible, in this Wesleyan context, that would be more controversial because not all, in fact, within the Nazarene denomination, we argue that the Bible is inspired by God, that it's inerrant with all things pertaining to salvation, but not inerrant in all things. So now we have Christian disagreement. So if your assumption is more than that the Bible is authoritative, but that it's inerrant, well, that might need some further support, right? Because it's an assumption that becomes controversial. What kinds of assumptions are being made? It's not bad to make assumptions. You just need to know your audience. You need to know, are these assumptions that are controversial that I need to support? Or are these assumptions that the majority of the people I'm speaking to agree with, and so I can just move forward? All right, so now let's start. So we've got two different types of arguments, deductive and inductive. I'm going to say a little bit about deductive and then a little bit about inductive. Deductive arguments. The goal of a deductive argument is to give a logically valid argument in the right structure, the right form. The logical structure of deductive arguments should create a necessary, you want to highlight that term, necessary link between the premises and the conclusion. Therefore, if the premises of a deductive argument are regarded as factual, then the conclusion must also be considered factual, because there's a necessary link. Deductive arguments argue by necessity. If, and that's a big question, if you accept the premises of a deductive argument, you have to accept the conclusion. A sound argument is a deductive argument that is logically warranted, meaning it's in the right form, and it has factual premises. There are various types of deductive arguments. I'm going to just highlight three here. One type of deductive argument is a categorical argument. This is where we create categories. An example would be things like all mammals are warm-blooded. That's premise one. I just abbreviate to P1. Joe is a mammal. Therefore, by necessity, we know that Joe is warm-blooded. That's a deductive argument, and the specific type of deductive argument is categorical. Another type of deductive argument is a conditional argument. These are if-then statements. Anytime you say if-then, you're creating certain logical relationships between the terms being used. So if I say, right, something like, if you drink liquid Drano, then you will get sick. Premise 2, you just drank liquid Drano. Conclusion, you're going to be sick. If you accept the premises, you must accept the conclusion, right? Maybe you'll reject one of these, but if you accept them, you must accept the conclusion. And then disjunctive arguments. These are either or, right? Premise 1, I will be in LA or San Diego on Tuesday. Premise 2, I was not in LA on Tuesday. Therefore, I can conclude with certainty that I had to be in San Diego, right? If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Keywords to let you know that you're dealing with a deductive argument. If you see words like all, none, no, every, never, these are categorical kinds of claims. They're often associated with deductive arguments. When you see if-then statements in an argument, it helps to know that you're probably dealing with deductive arguments. If you're dealing with either or, if you see words like necessarily, it must be the case, right? Certainly, inevitably, you can hear the necessity there between premise and conclusion. These are keywords to let you identify that, not for certain, but most likely you're dealing with a deductive argument there. All right, now let's move to inductive arguments. Inductive arguments. Here, there is no necessary link between the premise and conclusion. Instead, arguing inductively is arguing with probability. Therefore, if the premises are considered factual in an inductive argument, the conclusion is likely to be true, but it doesn't have to be true. With inductive arguments, the goal is not to have a valid argument, meaning with necessity, but a strong argument that adds probability. The majority of arguments that you find are inductive. It's very hard to make a sound deductive argument. Much easier to make a cogent inductive argument. Most of the arguments you make in this class will be inductive in nature, and we're going to spend more time on inductive arguments as a result. There are various types of inductive arguments. I'm only going to highlight 3 here, common types. One type of inductive argument, causal arguments. An example would be, every time I'm around Sarah's cat, my allergies act up. Premise 2, when I'm at home, my allergies don't flare up. Conclusion, I'm probably allergic to cats, or at least Sarah's cat. We're trying to figure out what's the cause. What's causing my allergies? I don't have them in other places, but when I go to Sarah's and she has a cat, my allergies act up. Well, background information tells us that people are often allergic to cats. There seems to be a connection between every time you go over there, your allergies flare up. But it's possible that you're allergic to something else, not the cat. So it's not a deductive argument. There's no argument by necessity here. It's by probability. It's possible that every time you go over to Sarah's, it's her perfume in her bathroom, or the soap she happens to wear, or maybe she serves a particular type of tea. So all those are possibilities that would say this isn't a necessary argument, but it certainly is a probable one. Second type of inductive argument, generalizations. We make these a lot. An example, premise 1, most college students are poor. Premise 2, Frank is a college student. Conclusion, therefore, Frank is probably poor. Again, it's possible that Frank is rich. There are rich college students. We're just making a generalization based on statistics and data available to us that it's likely he's poor if we don't know anything else about him, given that college students are often poor. Another kind of inductive argument is argument by analogy. We try to make connections between one thing and another. Premise 1, when we give medication X to chimpanzees, they react negatively to it. Premise 2, we know that chimpanzees are similar to humans in many respects. Primates, warm-blooded, mammals, etc., large brains. The conclusion then is, well, we can conclude that if we give the same medication to humans, we're probably going to get a similar reaction as we did to chimpanzees. We do this with medical testing all the time. Now, it's possible that there's something different about humans that means we react differently to the medication. So it's not an argument by necessity, it's just an argument through probability. Keywords to let you know that you're reading an inductive argument. Words like probably, most likely, sometimes, most of the time, not very often or very often, it is unlikely. These all sort of indicate that it's an inductive argument, most likely. So let's look at some sample arguments, just briefly, I'm throwing them out there. Very simple arguments, just 2 premises and a conclusion, to help us get used to this form of critical thinking. Being rational, I've argued, is being open-minded, really listening to arguments. Critical thinking is then analyzing arguments. Are they strong? Are they weak? Where? What questions do we have? What assumptions are being made? Are they good or bad assumptions? This is the process of critical thinking. We want to do it for other people's thinking, their arguments, but we also want to do it for our own arguments, and especially in your papers. The better you can evaluate your own ideas, the better paper you can write. So in this example, premise 1, abortion is the same as murder. Premise 2, murder is wrong. Conclusion, abortion is wrong. This is a deductive argument. If you accept the premises, you must accept the conclusion. So I've answered this question, inductive or deductive. Sorry about that. I should have let you think about that for a while. What premises would most likely be questioned? Excuse me, what premise? There's only 2. What premise would most likely be questioned? Do you think people are likely to question murder is wrong or abortion is the same as murder? I think we would all agree premise 1 is the more controversial premise. Premise 2, most people accept. So premise 1 is where most of the argument would need, right? Most of this would, if we're going to elaborate on this argument, which a paper of the length you're required to write would require, you need to elaborate, then most of the elaboration would have to go to proving this premise, showing this premise to be true, and then helping support that ultimate conclusion. Are there assumptions being made? And if so, what assumptions are being made? I think most of the assumptions are going to be surrounding premise 1 here. If abortion is the same as murder, then we have to assume something like fetuses have the same moral status as full-fledged humans, right? A fetus in the womb has the same moral status as a 5-year-old walking around, something like that. That's an assumption, and that probably needs to be supported to help premise 1 stand, right? So let's say we do that. Okay, well then let's try to support premise 1. So then we add an additional argument, right? Premise 1 often comes under attack. We will now try to support this premise. So here's a new argument supporting premise 1. Our new argument, premise 1, abortion is the deliberate killing of a human fetus. I don't think that's too controversial. Killing might be controversial, but we could certainly talk about termination, things like that. Premise 2, human fetuses are persons. Premise 3, any deliberate killing of a human person is murder. Conclusion, therefore abortion is murder. If we go back, we've tried to support premise 1 with that argument. Murder is wrong, that's a pretty standard belief. Then we've tried to support the conclusion, right? And we've made a longer, extended argument. This new argument, attempting to support premise 1, where do you think the questions will lie? What premise will be attacked? I don't think it's going to be premise 1, and I don't think it's going to be premise 3. Those things are widely accepted. It's going to be premise 2, that fetuses are equivalent, morally at least, to human persons. So often the idea is that no, when a fetus is developing early on, they are not the same as a person. So abortion is not the same as giving birth to a baby, letting it grow up for a year, and then murdering it. That there's something different morally, that they're not equivalent. How to unpack that is very difficult, but often that's where the argument lies, right, with premise 2. Not always, but often. So then we'd have to come up with another argument to defend premise 2, and this is how the abortion argument grows and grows and grows. Where are the places of contention? Can we go to support those places? And we elaborate. Now, you're not going to write a book, right? You're writing cap papers, so you can only take the argument so far to a reasonable place where you can continue to support it. But this is the kind of process we're working on, right? Another example of an argument might be, the Bible contains several factual contradictions. Premise 2, God never contradicts himself. Conclusion, therefore the words of the Bible were not dictated by God. Maybe the words of the Bible were inspired by God, but they couldn't have been dictated word for word if in fact there are contradictions. A couple of questions to think about. What kind of argument is this? Inductive or deductive? Right? So you can think about that. Which premise do you think is more controversial? At that point, you would say, okay, well, if I'm in favor of this argument, then I'm going to have to support. So let's say I'm in favor of this argument, and I think premise 1 is the more controversial. I'm going to have to spend time then trying to give data to show that the Bible contains factual contradictions, right? If I'm opposed to this argument, I need to try to find the weak element, the weak area, and let's assume it's premise 1, right? If I'm against this argument, now I'm going to need to show why there aren't contradictions. Maybe there are apparent contradictions, but if we look deeper, we realize that there is a coherence and not a contradiction, and then we support premise 1. I hope you're getting a sense of how argumentation works, how this kind of thinking, writing, right, reading, helps move us towards the truth, because we start to see what arguments are strong and can be supported. What arguments are weak and can't be supported? Where does most of the evidence lie? and we can really begin to sift through some of this. At this point, I'm going to stop this particular lecture. The next one will deal specifically with inductive arguments, going through several types of inductive arguments and several informal fallacies. I hope that you take the time. This first week, there's a lot of lecture. I'm just trying to get you familiar with sort of philosophy and evaluating ideas and arguments. So I hope it's helpful. I'm not trying to burden you. If at any time you feel like you understand all of this, that's fine. One thing you might want to do is to do some of the practices in your book. And if you can do those effectively, then maybe you don't need to listen to these lectures, but they're here for your assistance. Have a great day, and I'm looking forward to getting to know most of you online.